And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to do this. It's just such a pleasure it's always a pleasure to be back here at the CEREGE, and it's good to see old friends and meet new ones. So what I'd like to do today is use the 30 years of collaboration that we've had here. Actually, it's more than that. We actually, I think, started around '94. But use it as a basis for describing a case study in international interdisciplinary collaboration, and also as a case study in just kind of thinking about how, particularly to some of the younger researchers, how one takes your base of knowledge, your current competencies, and you build on that in order to move into new areas. So hopefully that will be of some interest to you. So. I was told that if we were very quick, that we could move faster to the aperitif. So here we go. One slide. No. Basically, overall messages, which I'll come back to at the end. New materials. There's always going to be new materials. And this is sort of like a full employment act for those of us working on looking at environmental impacts of humans on not only ecosystems but human health as well. So we're always making new materials, and so that's sort of something to think about moving forward. I think there's also a need for more data science. I mean, we're certainly seeing it in curricula in the United States as we think about curricula in environmental science and engineering, that using the new tools of information science, AI, and so on, that's more and more important. My own experiences is that, particularly at a group like CEREGE, which has such a strong foundation in the geosciences, that there's probably not as much biology as we need. So we probably need more biology, and I've certainly felt that in my own group. I watched some of my student colleagues when I was a graduate student. They would leave town for Christmas, and they'd come back, and those that were working with bacteria, all their bacteria would be dead. So I thought, I'm not going to do that. So, but I think despite that, we still need more biology. And then more organic analytical chemistry. I am a terrible organic chemist, and I'm an even worse analytical chemist. But we need more of that. I mean, particularly with some of that, when we're looking at more of these interactions of metabolic products, to go back to the biology, and when we're thinking about some of the contaminants and their interactions with the phases that we're, some of the colloidal phases that we're more comfortable with, we definitely need to be able to analyze those things, and so that's important. And then, of course, international. As I said, I want to use this as sort of a case study in international and interdisciplinary collaboration. So that's something that the CEREGE from the very beginning has always been very, very strong in. And when Daniel Nahon began to put together the various groups here, he was very conscious of the idea of getting beyond the consanguinité that often is part of many research groups, and having people come in with an international perspective. And that's been so obvious, certainly I'm going to focus very much on the interface group within this 30 years. I'm sorry, I don't know very much about hard rock geology, but there's certainly been an international tendency there, and I've seen it in the other groups as well. Okay, so with that in mind, how did I get first involved in the CEREGE? Well, it was Jean-Yves Bottereau, who we had actually been working together. You'll find, by the way, I don't know if it's just me, but all the pictures I could find of Jean-Yves, he always had a bottle of wine pretty much in front of him there. And I said it went back to '94, but there's actually archival evidence that this goes back to the 19th century in terms of our collaborations. This is a picture of my research group with Jean-Yves when he was visiting there, as I said, in the mid-1800s. A lot of people coming and going, two very important ones, Mélanie Auffan and Jérôme Rose, who I had the good fortune, they both came and did postdoctoral work with me at different institutions, Jérôme at Rice University and Mélanie at Duke. and lots of other people coming and going. And so there's a picture of Greg Lowry, who has spent some time here at the CEREGE. He's in the TGV. Peter Weichsland has also spent time here. Matt and Mélanie, Helen Shi Kim, Malia, who did actually a dual doctorate between Aix-Marseille and Duke, and others. So a lot of people coming and going. And how did this one turn upside down? That's a shame. Well, anyway, no, really, that is an odd thing that happened with the transfer here. Yeah, we had a lot of meetings, again, with wine. Always Jean-Yves and Jerome, I guess he learned from the best. Really just kind of, I mean, if you go in and drill down on who some of the participants are in this here, you can kind of trace them to a lot of the people that are here at the CEREGE today. Okay, well, before Jean-Yves came to the CEREGE, and before Daniel Naon had the good taste to hire him, he and I were working together on membranes. And the topic of membranes is important. This was work that he had started. We actually co-advised a doctoral student, Véronique Laussin-Turcot, at the time. And membranes were important because it's what ultimately got us into some other topics. But we both also shared a love of particles, and Hélène Groux, who came from the CEREGE, came in postdoc and was looking at fine particles, things that we would later call natural nanoparticles in colloidal runoff. This was in the Houston area. And so the characterization of these particles, the quantification of the sources and so on, this was quite important. Back to membranes, there was a colleague of mine, Andy Barron, who has also visited the CEREGE at the time when we were writing a book. And Andy had come up with a sort of an alternative chemistry to sol gel. For those of you that are familiar with sol gel, you precipitate very small particles and then you use them for different things. What Andy had done is he was working with an aluminum chemistry to, instead of going from bottom up, he was going from top down. So he would start with boehmite and break it down, adding organic acids to form a suspension of nanoparticles that then my big idea was to take those particles, deposit them on a support, and use them to make ceramic membranes. And so Maria Feldagel Cortelesi was involved with that work. Jerome, when he came to postdoc, being brilliant as he is, he was able to take the allomoxane chemistry and turn that into the ferroxane chemistry. So instead of starting with boehmite, he used the analog of lepidocrosite and did the same thing. And so we were able to make, it turned out the most interesting materials were an unsupported ceramic ferroxane-derived membrane. And we were able to use that for fuel cell applications and so on. All right, so we're making nanoparticles, we're making membranes. All of that's happening in sort of the late 1990s. And by the way, I've tried to show some of the papers that were co-published during that period. And as I started to put this together, I realized I couldn't, even in this talk, there's no way I could put all those papers in. That's how much collaboration there's been. But in we'd been making membranes using nanoparticles. There was a Nobel Prize for the discovery of C60 at Rice University, where I was at the time, Richard Smalley. And I was here on sabbatical in '99 and thinking about some of the work we were doing and the CEREGE's approach to looking at things really at the nanometric scale analytically. We weren't talking nano so much at that point, but that's what was going on. And so it was really here at the CEREGE and that the light bulb went off, and I thought we should have a whole research effort on this. In fact, my initial, and I still think this is quite important, we should have an ongoing research effort looking constantly at new technologies. I talked about new materials, but it should be really for new technologies. At the time, I wanted to include things like information technologies. I couldn't have even imagined thinking about the impact of CO2 emissions on doing a Google search. at the time. But that's the kind of thing that we want to try to anticipate. Well, anyway, we were thinking about this in the context of nanomaterials, and I had the bad luck to make a statement, the one here at the bottom where I didn't know there was press in the room, but I was summarizing a new center that Rick Smalley and I and some others at Rice had just gotten on the applications of nanoscience to environmental engineering and bioengineering. And I sort of summarized, the summary was supposed to be, so we can do all these great things with nanomaterials, but we also need to think about the potential consequences for human health and the environment. And I summarized it as you can see it written there, and then I left to come to CEREGE for the summer, and when I came back, my mailbox was full of hate mail from nanoscientists all over the world saying, oh, this is terrible, you're going to destroy the nanoscience movement that we've started, and it was an exciting time. Anyway, the point is that we very quickly moved into this notion of looking at, we had, Tinkerbell was supposed to be the good side of nano, right, or the nice things that we can do with it, and Darth Vader was the potential perils or the dark side. And we had this center, CBEN, the one I'd mentioned with Rick Smalley, and that center, along with, obviously it was Rice at that time, and the institute I was directing, and the CEREGE, and then with support from the French Embassy, we organized the first ever international conference on nanotechnology and the environment. That happened at Rice, and it was quite a nice event. I mean, already when you have a Nobel laureate there, that was nice. We had the former science advisor and the head of NSF speaking as well. So it was a good way to sort of get attention in the field. And in the meantime, we were publishing in these areas. So Hélène Le Cohenet, who was postdocing with me at the time, we did one of the first studies ever on to go back to soils. I mean, it was looking at the transport of nanomaterials in porous media, and we had soils definitely in mind. So that's kind of the dark side. And on the Tinkerbell, the light side, that we also published work on nanotechnologies as a tool for sustainability. So this is, to go back to the ferroxane membranes, this just shows you some examples of power density in a fuel cell as a function of current density. These curves where you compare, you basically use the ferroxane membrane as the center of the fuel cell and replace the Nafion membrane that's usually in that, and that looked quite attractive. This remains really very much unfinished work because we can only do this with the unsupported membrane. We haven't been able to do it with the supported membrane yet. The efficiency falls apart. George Wells was an undergraduate at Rice, and he also picked up on this ferroxane theme, and he came and spent some time here at the CEREGE and did some work on reactive membranes, so doing Fenton reactions, basically, for degradation of contaminants across membranes. In the realm of particles and particle deposition, this is always, particles and the shapes that they form have been a long-standing interest of mine, and so we were doing a lot of work both experimentally and in simulations looking at particles, how they deposit on surfaces, and how that varies as a function of the chemistry of the particles and the flow conditions and so on. And that, again, to go back to membranes, there was a study that we did. We looked at the morphology of fouling layers on nanofiltration membranes that seemed to be largely explained based on some of the issues of particle deposition that we were collaborating on. Okay, so we're thinking about particles, their uses, and we're moving into this realm of the possible implications. And so the real question that I think one that's just sort of long-standing that we need to keep in mind for all these new technologies is how do you predict exposure, hazard, and benefit for a product that doesn't exist yet, right? I mean, usually when if you say, PFAS is a problem, well, there's already damages out there that one could go back retroactively and evaluate. But the idea of trying to predict what the damages will be and trying to predict what the benefits will be, that's a very different kind of question. And it's one that, again, to get into this forecasting notion of environmental net benefit of new technologies. That's something we need to get into. And so we put together, there were a number of different initiatives to kind of work through these things with nanomaterials. We had the center, when I moved to Duke in 2006, we very quickly managed to get a center in competition with Rice University. But anyway, the Center for the Environmental Implications of Nanotechnology. With funding from the CNRS, we had an international branch of that, and we had all sorts of interactions here with the CEREGE under the form of iSaint. The CEREGE itself followed suit, and it got a similar large sum of funding for Serenade, which I think you're all aware of. And then the so-called INNOVE, which is again a collaborative effort between the CEREGE and Duke. And now we have InFrames, which is really kind of a continuation of the Serenade Saint song, where the idea is to bring together researchers in these communities, U.S. and Europe, and talk about new materials or advanced materials. Okay, the discussion in Europe, as you know, has now moved beyond nanomaterials. That's kind of old. It's now new, depending on which country, and new strategic advanced materials. But it goes back to the idea that, again, we're making new stuff. What's it going to do to human health and the environment? This is a paper that Jean-Yves and I did. I guess I didn't put the date on this, did I? But it is fairly early on. And again, it describes this changing profile of benefit and risk that occurs over time. So the idea that, just in this example, and you could sketch it out differently for different technologies, but often early on, people get very excited about the possibilities of a new technology, and so they overestimate, with great degrees of uncertainty, they overestimate what the benefit would be, and maybe they tend to understate what the risk might be. Now, you could flip it around. It sort of depends on what the circumstances are, but you can imagine that over time, those bands of uncertainty tend to decrease. So in the rollout of a new technology, you often hear about the valley of death, right? Is that a term most people know? So where you have a lot of investment sort of at the university lab scale, and a lot of venture capital that's willing to take it up to the largest scale, but there's this in-between area that they refer to as the valley of death. Well, this, to me, is the mountain of uncertainty, right? You go through a period, potentially with a new technology, where if you overestimate the benefits and well, let's take it back to the commercializations. If you underestimate the benefits and you overestimate the risk with all that uncertainty, you're going to have this mountain that you can't get over to commercialize the technology. And that might be a good thing. It might be that it really was a risky technology and it shouldn't have gone out there. But on the other hand, it might be that you just cut off the next most efficient solar cell, right? So this mountain of uncertainty is kind of an attribute that was of interest to us. We also introduced some of the notation and so on for doing value chain and life cycle assessments of technologies. So again, for emerging technologies, those are two concepts, value chain and life cycle, which are quite important to us in looking at impacts all along the way on various environmental compartments. We rolled out this idea, so in an ideal world, we would have, the goal was to have nanoparticle properties, and we'd know everything about the nanoparticles, and we would be able to forecast what their risk is at the bottom. But that is basically an intractable problem. And so to get to answers that people were demanding rather urgently in the early 2000s, we came up with this idea of functional assays, which were measurements, quantitative measurements that one could take in relatively complex systems to give you some answers about the behavior of the materials. And one of those is that I tend to obsess on is the stickiness of particles. That's alpha in this equation, and beta is some of the transport properties. But without getting into all the weeds on this, we've spent a tremendous amount of time collaboratively in our groups looking at this. looking at the properties of the nanomaterials themselves. Jérôme Labille did some very nice work on just looking at how C60 behaves in water, and then how it moves around in porous media, how it aggregates, and Antoine Till's work on heteroaggregation and so on. Well, these are a concept like alpha as a functional assay. Really, what the idea is it takes all the complexity of all the things that it might depend on, and as you move out in this wheel, you get to more and more fundamental things like, viscosity and Hamaker's constant and so on. So it lumps all that together and gives you a short-term answer to some of the longer-term challenges that we have. Okay, so much of what I'm presenting today, we wrote up in a paper that Mélanie is a co-author on that really summarizes some of the stuff that we learned over the years, and we posed it as a series of lessons learned. And I've just picked out a few of those here. So one of the lessons is that the toxicity of small particles can be largely predicted from the following things. Mélanie, very early on, did some tremendous work just thinking about redox couples between some of these metals and biomolecules as a basis for predicting their toxicity. And it took Andre Nell's group at UCLA and several tens of millions of dollars of doing high throughput assays to come to the conclusion that Mélanie was right. And so that was definitely a nice paper. The only I shouldn't say the only, but one of the things that has stood in the way of both regulations and in some sense communication between researchers is the definition of nanomaterials itself. And we're seeing that question, by the way, it's coming up again in the context of micro nanoplastics, which I'll come to later on. But again, we did a nice paper, Mélanie did a nice paper on the definitions of nanoparticles and what that means in the context of the environment, health, and safety research around nano. One of the other lessons we learned was that exposure, dose, and so-called ADME effects, the way things are transited through the body, that they can differ from both materials. Okay, so if you do a dose-response curve for a nanomaterial, it might be different from the dose-response curve for the same material dissolved, say dissolved zinc versus nanoparticulate zinc. And it's not because the underlying mechanism of toxicity is different, it's because they can go places and deliver things at concentrations that are different. So the idea that we ultimately developed mathematically was that you have, say a nanoparticle here, that it goes through some transport. Again, the transfer here got rid of the Greek, but that should be beta and alpha there. So there's transport, there's attachment, and then when it gets to the target, let's say a bacterium, let's say this is a silver nanoparticle, it arrives at the surface of a bacterium, it begins to dissolve, it denatures proteins, and it kills the bacterium. So you can explain that, as it turns out, that kind of reaction, using the sort of expression here where the overall rate of inactivation in that case, so to use that example of the bacteria, the overall rate of inactivation is a function of the surface chemistry, the interactions between the particles is alpha, the stickiness between the affinity of a particle and that surface. Lauren Barton came, and she also did much of her doctoral work here at the CEREGE, and showed that for the oxidation of cerium dioxide, that you could explain the rates of the differences in rates of oxidation based again, or actually it was inactivation of the bacteria in the activated sludge that she was using. But it could be explained as a function of the alpha, or the stickiness coefficient for those things. And again, we've explored this notion of surface affinity and its effect on impact in a large number of different publications. Fabian Schwab, a Swiss researcher who postdoced with me at Duke, later came and worked here at the CEREGE, and She did work on, she did all sorts of things, looking really primarily at plant nanoparticle interactions when she was with me, but she also was looking at taking carbon nanotubes and loading them up with an herbicide, so with the prospect of being able to deliver that herbicide locally as a more efficient way of using an herbicide in a plant scenario. So in other words, this reaction here would be the release of the herbicide at the end point there. So again, a number of different situations that we've looked at and from the standpoint of looking at nanoparticle reactivity. Transformations turned out to be a key thing, and again, we need to keep that in mind as we move into to other materials. And Mélanie Auffan led the effort here at the CEREGE to establish a mesocosm facility, which I guess is housed in the new building, is that right? And we had a mesocosm facility at Duke, and we did a lot of things trying to compare what happens in the lab with what happens out in a controlled, a more complex system. And sometimes, I mean, you take everything, you do the same experiment in the lab that you thought you did out in the field, and the toxicity could be higher or lower. And usually the differences we concluded in most cases had to do with what you forgot to bring back from the field into the lab. So without going into the details of that, again, those differences are important, and these kinds of systems that the CEREGE has access to are quite important for being able to, in the general case, look at environmental impacts of materials. So it shouldn't be of any surprise to us. I mean, we're all made of nanomaterials. Someone said at one point, if you want to see an example of nanotechnology, look in the mirror. Right? We're all assemblages of nanoscale objects. And so it shouldn't have been of any surprise to us that organisms have evolved over time to be able to use nanoscale objects to take up nutrients, to defend themselves from nanoscale objects like viruses and so on. But nonetheless, we were very interested in using these exquisitely designed materials, these metals and metal oxides that we can easily trace in complex media because the contrast is there, right? We were able to follow things like bioaccumulation and trophic transfer and maternal transfer and so on. And again, collaborations and looking at how, in this case, transport through root tips in plants. We realized along the way that we, like many other research groups in Europe and the United States, we were all accumulating data. This goes to a question actually that came up earlier about the data here at the CEREGE. Well, I mean, this was just for this one community. All the data platforms that were out there were really not adequate for the uses that we had in mind. And we also very quickly came to the conclusion that there would never be one data platform, one database that would bring all of the data together. Okay, there's all sorts of issues of proprietary nature of the data and so on that one needs to address. But we did develop an architecture that was particularly convenient for us in the realm of nanomaterials, the idea of an instance-based mapping, where an instance is really just a place and a time. And so you have for example, nanosilver is a powder. You can characterize that nanosilver, so everything that's down here is characterization of, in this case, the nanomaterial. And then everything that's along the top is the characterization of the place, the medium. It might be the blood of fish, or it might be a marine environment at some specific location, and so on. It might be taken up by a plant, so that the place might be in plant tissue and so on. So this notion of instance mapping as a general principle, we're not saying that we're going to have one. We developed the NIC, the Nanoinformatics Knowledge Commons, but more importantly, and the CEREGE played such an important role in this, was getting a large community of people on board with the overall notion of instance mapping for whatever data platform they might develop. Finally, the exposure to natural, we were spending, a couple decades looking at engineered nanomaterials. That seemed to be where people were most concerned. But the exposures to those, as we know, are relatively small. In fact, they're minuscule compared with the reservoir of natural nanomaterials and incidental nanomaterials. So if you have, a forest fire and all the smoke that comes off of that, or if you have whatever is coming out of your tailpipe. So the notion being that if you want to minimize risk associated with exposure to nanomaterials, and you have €1 to spend, hopefully you're going to have more than that, but would that €1 be better spent on reducing and controlling engineered nanomaterials, or should one be reducing the possibility of forest fire, or should one be limiting what's changing from diesel fuel to electric cars so that you eliminate what's coming out of the tailpipe and so on. So we've moved, I'd say this, overall much more to thinking about, in terms of the importance of risk overall, thinking about incidental, which would be the tailpipe, and natural nanomaterials, and because there's just so much more of them. Along the way, as we went through that whole, some people like to say journey, as we went through that whole process, we wrote a book twice. We revised it, and it involved a lot of the people in the room here. But again, an example of the collaboration that we were undergoing. As I said, we recently wrote a paper that basically built on what we had learned from Nano and said, taking that experience, what does this mean for many of us that worked in Nano have moved to where the money is, I'm sorry to say, but in plastics. And so looking at micro and nanoplastics, and so the idea is how do we use what we've learned from Nano in the context of this other emerging problem. So we're back at the beginning, which is the end. Again, just to repeat, new materials, it could be, we're looking at plastics and the additives that they contain and what's being released, but there's materials, the next realm might be bioplastics, and so let's kind of think through that problem. As we propose a solution to one problem, let's make sure that we're not creating another problem. But always new materials. We definitely need more data science, and we need it at the education level. Our students, as they come out today, it's so hard to get the attention of people in information science to work on our problems with the level of sophistication, the tools that are available out there, because frankly, they're distracted by, not distracted, but they're employed by other problems having to do with robotics and with drug discovery and a host of other things. So we need to grow our own students with a knowledge of data science. More biology, I think I've made the case for that, and I've already explained the organic chemistry and my insecurities, my personal insecurities there. So, and then finally the international. For me, the first E in CEREGE will always be, I know the interpretation of the acronym has changed, but for me, the first E in CEREGE will always be European, because it speaks to the aspiration of international. It speaks to the aspiration of global collaboration, and we don't ever want to move away from that. And so you might call it something else, but for me, the CEREGE will always be an international and European-based, building on the excellence of expertise and the recognition that Europe, as well as the rest of the world, can give the CEREGE for the work that's going on here. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marc. Do you have any questions? I might have one. Maybe it's more a comment. when you said that we need more biology, you're from Duke and you have a lot of biologists working with chemists, physicists. So you have this interdisciplinary in your study, in all your projects. What do you mean by we need more biology?
Well, I mean, for example, so I didn't really talk about it, but we are hopefully launching a thesis on the topic of biomolecules and hemoglobin, and so that requires a certain knowledge of biochemistry and biology. And my own background, as I said, is not really one of biology. Yours is more of geochemistry, but you very successfully managed to add to your toolkit when you came to Duke some of the nanotoxicology and so on. I think we need more of that. That's what I'm saying. We need people that understand toxicology, like the toxicologists. We need people that understand biochemistry, like the biochemists. We need microbiologists that understand things about microbiomes and how materials impact the microbiome. That's what I mean. A deafening silence.
Hello. I don't know much about nanoparticles, but in the frame of the symposium, so what would be the future for nanoparticles? In which field you think there might be some improvement?
Yeah. So that's what I tried to say here is I think taking what we know about nanomaterials and applying it to new materials is important. So that's definitely one thing that's here. I've also, so far, here at this symposium, I've heard that data science is important, and that definitely resonates with me. I mentioned just a second ago that we have more biology in terms of where I think collaborations that bring in the biological sciences with some traditional geochemistry and so on, that is going to be quite important. Of course, geochemists, we have biogeochemistry, right? So, but I think that's an important direction. We're also, going back to particles and particle deposition, so that kind of goes back to the very beginning of what we were talking about with particles depositing on membranes. So we have a doctoral student now who's just beginning her work in collaboration with Duke, University of Arizona, and the CEREGE on looking at, I thought I had a slide on that there. Yeah, this is, well, new direction. So it's building on actually some work from a doctoral student in my group who was looking at particles on their deposition on solar cells. And so I think this is quite interesting for a group of geochemists to understand, well, the solar cell, if its efficiency is diminished because the particles are piling up, but where do those particles come from? What's the effect of a Sahara sandstorm on the solar cells that are somewhere else in the world? How do we identify sources, and by identifying the sources, how do we mitigate the possible problems with that? So this was some of the suggestions I had for other ways to go, again, involving biology, transport of genetic material, and interactions of particles with other technologies.
Mark, in your concluding remarks, you put new material in the first list of your shopping list. And I would like to ask you, what for you is the most challenging material to study for scientists especially? What is it? Plastic, nanoplastic, or something else?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, I mean, the challenging could be from a couple of things. One is the complexity of the material itself. If you had a mixture of different kinds of things. Plastics are such a mixture. It's not really a new emerging material. It's more of a legacy material, but that's definitely challenging. I mean, we don't have good analytical methods for tracking plastics because the contrast issue, right? I mean, looking at a carbon on a carbon background. So even though a lot of people seem to think that pyrolysis GCMS or FTIR or Raman scattering can handle some of these things, I think there's a lot of skepticism about that. So, you know, a colleague of mine at Duke, they took a bunch of cadavers and they looked for plastics in the brains. You probably heard about this, this study, right? No? Well, by looking at the plastics in the brains and with all of the caveats to how, you know, can we really measure this or not, their conclusion was is we're all of us walking around with about 1 credit card of plastic in our brain. And the older the cadavers, the more plastic. So it is a time variable thing. We're accumulating, you know, brains are interesting things. They tend to take things up, but there's not a lot of ways for things to get out.
I have a question, Mark. What about the nanoparticles in wine?
In wine, it's everywhere. I mean, there's nanoplastics in wine, for sure. I mean, there's lots of naturally occurring nanoparticles in wine, but yeah.
My question is a bit in the continuation of Jean-Do's question. I was wondering, I know you do a lot of experimental studies, but I was wondering if you could comment on our capacity to, first of all, sample and analyze colloids in the environment. Do you think there's like a way that we'll be able to do this as easily for colloids as we are doing it for dissolved material?
I'm not sure that I understand your question.
Oh, so far we're like in the environment easily able to quantify dissolved like solutes.
Mm-hmm.
But colloidal material and nanoparticles are not so easily.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
the throughput is very low. It's really bulky to quantify them and to characterize them. Can you comment on improvements in this field in the last decades and where you see that going?
Well, there have been improvements. I mean, I think one of the biggest ones has been in the area of rapid image analysis. Okay, so we can now track individual particles, as you know, look at their Brownian motion, and do that particle by particle and add them up very quickly. I mean, that just would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago, but it's easy now. But the bottom line with particles, I mean, when you're looking at particles, I mean, Avogadro's number is not on your side, right? With solutes, I mean, you've got Avogadro's number, but particles, you're way below. And so just the law of averages is not going to be helping you.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks again, Mark.